Hello, best ever listeners, and welcome to the best real estate investing advice ever show. I'm Theo Hicks, and we are back with another edition of the Actively Passive Investing Show. It'll be me and Travis Watts. Travis, how are you doing today?
Theo, doing great, man. Doing the celery juice for those who listen. The last episode was all about celery juice.
Yeah, I was joking and said that Travis needed to have that last week where we started it, and he was just the camera would go to him, and he'd be slurping down his celery juice. So yes, we talked about the celery juice health hacks in last week's first actively passive investing show. Today we're going to get back to more specifics as to your passive investing business, and we're going to talk about how to be frugal, how to save like the wealthy. So we're going to dive into another one of Travis's amazing blog posts. He did a really good job with this blog post, very detailed, lots of sources. So he's not just making this stuff up. He's actually basing it off of what high net worth people, what wealthy people are doing. So he has it broken down into three categories. And so I'll let Travis maybe tell us the background on why he wrote this blog post, and then we'll jump into category number one, which is housing.
Sure, yeah. I thought this would be interesting. So I was raised by two very frugal parents, and frugality's played a huge role in my life and my family's life. And I think it gets kind of maybe a bad rep from time to time. I think a lot of people confuse being cheap with being frugal. And I just thought, hey, here's a cool idea. Let's take a look at what high net worth individuals do, some of the most wealthy folks out there, or even just general, millionaires. I pulled some studies just on that in the US. Let's see how they're being frugal as compared to just kind of the average stats, of the majority of people. So what I found through this research is that people spend their money in America on three primary categories. That's housing, transportation, and food, as you probably could have guessed those categories. But I just thought, well, let's take a look at maybe a different perspective into these, and let's see what people with essentially endless amounts of money are doing in those categories. So that's kind of what prompted it, just self-interest, really. I've always been, an advocate of frugality, and I just wanted to paint the picture a different way. So that's kind of what spawned this article.
Perfect. So let's jump into those three categories. So category number one, which I'm assuming is the category that people spend the most amount of their money on, which is housing.
Yeah. So with housing, the statistic is, and all this, the links and the sources and all that, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, all that kind of stuff is in the blog. So if you want to actually go to the source and figure all this stuff out, feel free. But the bottom line is that Americans spend roughly 30% of household income on housing, which makes sense, right? So that number has crept up over the years. I see that as being a pretty high number, but a couple things I want to think about were, obviously we have the extreme cases, like a lot of people know the story of, Warren Buffett, how he bought his home in Omaha, Nebraska, 50 plus years ago for $31,000, and he hasn't moved since. He hasn't upgraded. He doesn't have these mansions. He's stayed pretty humble in that category. But that's easy to discredit. Oh, Warren, that's just him. He's just super crazy. Okay. So then I want to take kind of a more also well-known individual, but not near the net worth or wealth of Warren Buffett. So I decided I had to pull stats and facts from public figures because they're publicly available. I wanted people to see the sources there. So I took Tim Cook, who's the CEO of Apple, and he's out there in basically Silicon Valley. And so here's how I kind of painted the picture. So Tim Cook has an overall net worth estimated around $650 million. Okay, so not nearly Warren Buffett's $80 billion, but $650 million. And he bought his home out in California for $1.9 million. And if you put that in perspective, let's say that Tim, I don't know if Tim paid cash or he mortgaged this house, but if he paid cash, that's 3% of his net worth. I mean, he certainly could have kind of upped the ante, right? He could have bought virtually any home he wanted at that kind of net worth and or salary. Speaking of salary, that was in 2019, he earned a total compensation of about 125 million from Apple. And so assuming that he mortgaged his home with like a traditional loan, 20% down, he'd have payments of around $7,500 a month. So if you put that in perspective of how much does he pay month to month, year to year, it was like 0.072% of what he's earning towards housing. So obviously with the high net worth, it's a little bit skewed, but the point is between, and guys, there's hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of these examples. But the point is these folks could put any amount of money they wanted to into housing, but they choose the frugality path. They choose to have what I refer to as enough. They have a nice home and it's enough. They're not trying to keep up with the Joneses. They're not trying to say Warren Buffett's not looking at someone that has a $90 billion net worth and go, oh, he's got a bigger home. I'm going to increase my house. I'm going to have 5 cars because he only has 4. The point is figure out what enough is for you and be content with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And something that I looked up because I was just curious about Tim Cook because he lives in California. And so $1.9 million is not going to get you a long way in California. Mm-mm. And he's not in this blog post, but his house is only 2,400 square feet.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't even go that far into the.
It's a dinky little guy. And one thing that I was thinking about when I was reading this was the first house that I lived in was like 2,000 square feet, and we lived really close to like a city. And then we moved to Florida into a suburb, and your money can go a lot further there. And so we had this really, really big house. Yeah. And I remember we're there, and then when I first moved there, I'm like, oh, this is amazing because it was so much bigger than our first house. And then once I got used to it, I was like, oh man, you know what's going to happen is when we move, we're going to have to move into a bigger house to get that wow factor again. So luckily, when we moved to Chicago, we downgraded back into a smaller house. So that's one thing too, is you kind of mentioned with the Joneses is kind of the runaway effect where you get something new, it's really great, and then you get used to it, and then you need to get something bigger and better next time to get that same feeling. And so just kind of being aware of that and realizing that feeling is only going to last for a little bit. You get your brand new massive house. People that live in these massive mansions, I promise you they're used to it, and it's just completely normal to them, just how your house, your apartment is completely normal to you. So that's one thing I wanted to say.
Yeah, that's a great point. My wife and I have gone through it too. I mean, there was a time where we were kind of on that conveyor belt, so to speak. And at a certain point, it's like, wait a second, it's just us. It's just 2 of us. It's like, what's our next step? Do we need a 5-bedroom house now? It gets kind of stupid. And so we actually started going the opposite way. My wife especially got really into this like minimalism trend, and so we started giving everything away and downsizing. And to your point, yeah, I mean, we went the other way with it. As we got to about the size of Tim Cook's house, so 2,400 square foot, then it was like 1,200, and then it was 900. We went the other way. But yeah, it's just knowing what's practical and what's enough. I mean, you're never going to impress, the world by just getting one step ahead each time. There's always 1,000 people above you, so just figure it out for yourself. So
yeah, and I think kind of going back to what we were talking about last week with the health and the mindset stuff, I think it's more about getting getting a house and making it into a place that you feel good in, making your office into what you want it to be. As opposed to just getting a massive house and just moving into it. So something else I wanted to mention too was so you mentioned here that the data shows that nearly 30% of household income is spent on housing costs, and so this is the actively passive investing. So it's a really, really good way to really quickly determine if an apartment deal is good or really any investing deal is good. When it comes to either, if you're a fix and flipper or if you're just investing in an apartment, really any type of investing, you take a look at what the cost is for the house, right? What the housing payment is going to be, what the rent payment is going to be on the average, and then compare that to the median income. And see what that ratio is. So if it's 30%, then you know that half the people, at least half the people in that area can afford to live there. But if it's like 60%, then you're not going to have a lot of you're not going to have a strong demand for that apartment in that area. So it's a really good way. It's not the only thing you do, but it's really kind of fast way to see, okay, can people afford to live at this apartment community? You want it to be 30% or less, that number.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point.
And then the other thing I wanted to ask you, so I know a lot of people like Robert Kiyosaki, for example, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, he talks about how, having your own house is a liability, not an asset. And I think Grant Cardone, at least when I last heard him talk about this, mentioned that renting, your house is a lot better than owning your house. Yeah. So I was wondering, from a frugality perspective, do you think that one is better than the other, or does it just kind of depend?
Yeah, Robert Kiyosaki is another one of those guys similar to Warren Buffett. I forget the years and the data and the stats, but he bought his home back in whatever, like the early 90s, late 90s, and has never moved since. Bought a nice home, not a mansion, just a nice home. He wasn't that wealthy back then. And same thing. Yeah, your house is a liability. So they went through the 2008, 2009, they held on, they came back up. He hadn't sold. Yeah. And Grant Cardone's big thing is, own the rentals and rent your owner occupied place. So he's got his place out in Miami and he travels kind of around with his family and rents. And my wife and I actually do the same thing right now. So we eventually personally kind of came to that conclusion where we were choosing to rent instead of own. But it's kind of that, for us, it's more of a flexibility lifestyle. We like to travel a lot. We like to move occasionally. So it just made more sense. But it also makes sense, to your point, as a home is liability. So how much of our equity do we want to tie up in something that may not earn us money and may potentially actually lose us money, depending on how we're buying? And so it's funny that the stigma that still exists out there around renting. And it's like, hey, man, some of the wealthiest people out there are renting, and there's a good reason for it. You just got to dig a little deeper and run the numbers to figure that out.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a natural transition into the number two, which is transportation. So I'll let you get into that. But I guess I'm assuming your answer is going to be the same, but leasing versus owning a vehicle. I want to know what your thoughts were on that when it comes to being frugal. But I'll let you kind of go through transportation the same way you went through housing.
Yeah, sure. So let me just reference here real quick. It was Experian Automotive, which was published in Forbes. They found that 61% of wealthy individuals, and when I say wealthy, they define that as earning more than $250,000 per year in household income, drove Hondas, Toyotas, and Fords as their primary vehicles. And I thought that was really interesting. Just so many people, myself included, way back when, are striving for one day I'm going to have the Mercedes, the BMW, the whatever. And I've owned all those cars, but yeah, it's just, it's another liability that's just going to go straight down in value, and we'll talk about the lease own thing. But here was something kind of interesting is I pulled this list there. Again, there's so many examples, but here's just a few billionaires who drive vehicles valued under $30,000. We're talking about billionaires and vehicles under $30,000. Not just one vehicle they own. This is their primary driving vehicle. So Steve Ballmer, billionaire, Ford Fusion hybrid, $30,000 MSRP. Mark Zuckerberg, an Acura, $30,000 MSRP. Jeff Bezos is famously, known to drive that old Honda Accord that he had, which was like $20,000, I think, when it was new, but he didn't even buy it new. And then, just on and on. But there's so many billionaires driving these inexpensive vehicles, and I think for the same reason. I mean, couldn't all of these folks just go buy the Lamborghini and the Bentley and the Ferrari? And of course, some do, but a lot don't. And so the statistics by AAA is that the average American spending $9,282 per year on a vehicle, not household vehicles, a vehicle, which is about $773 a month. And so if you equate that to, the average household income, which is around 61,000 per year, that's 15% of household income dedicated to a vehicle. So pretty crazy. And it's just fun to like think about these stats and then get out there when you're on the road and driving and looking around, and all I see are new cars everywhere. Everyone's just trying to keep up with each other. And it's like, but the average incomes. And so again, it's kind of, I'm a big advocate for, it's not what you buy, it's how you buy it. When I mentioned earlier that I've owned, luxury cars, whatever, Range Rovers, I've had Porsches, I've had all this stuff, but I've never paid more than $13,000 for a vehicle. I've always bought used in good condition, had a good mechanic lined up, and that's just how I've bought vehicles. So it's not to say you can't have those vehicles, but I've always kept them at such a small margin, either to income or to net worth, with the exception of one bad thing I did when I was younger, when I was trying to keep up with the Joneses myself. So
was that the Porsche or the?
That was I bought a Range Rover when I had a very low income.
Yeah, you mentioned how when you drive on the road, you see the cars that people are driving. Because right before the pandemic started, we were looking at getting a new car because we only had one, and then my wife's company car went away. And so we're looking at cars, and I was like, these cars are so expensive, and I see people driving them, and I'm really confused at how people can afford to drive a car that's $80,000. And then you also mentioned too that this is only on one car. So people are spending 15% of their income on one single car. And so, double that, then they're spending 30 on cars, 30 on housing. It's pretty wild. And then add to that, and fortunately for us, we didn't buy that second vehicle. I don't know what we would be doing since everyone works from home now and no one's even really driving in the first place. You've got 50% of your household income just sitting in your garage, sitting on the street. So that's I think this is a huge one, especially now, and maybe thinking of creative ways to only owning one car, kind of doing what Travis does and getting a used car for cheap. Let's quickly, because we're running out of time here, let's transition to number 3, because I think this is the most important one, I think, because this is one that can definitely get away from you, and that's food.
Yeah. That's right. And this is one of my favorite topics too. And just to real quick to wrap up on the last topic. So I wrote another blog, and it's called something like, The Journey and Life Hacks or something like that. I wrote it a long time back, but in there, I talk in a lot more detail about buying, used cars and cheap, and food specifically. So to the point of food, this was really interesting. I came across a study. It's called the National Study of Millionaires. Is actually a study done by the Dave Ramsey team. And they study, I think it was 10,000 millionaire households in the US, and they get all the data on where they spend their money and that kind of stuff. And this was interesting to me that non-millionaires spend 57% more on food costs compared to millionaires, which was just blew my mind. In addition to that, when we talk about restaurants, which is the thing that can get away from you most easily, right? There's often, not always, it's just a kind of a generalization, but the statistic is that there's an average of a 300% markup on the food that you're buying or the beverages that you're buying at a restaurant. So to put that in perspective, a meal you might be able to make at home for $5, you're at least going to pay $15 at a restaurant, sometimes $20, $25 plus tip and tax and everything else. So it can really get away from you and add up. In terms of personal finance and budgeting, to me, this is the number one category. Housing, obviously, if you're flexible and willing to, downsize or compromise. But I mean, food can absolutely be 100% in your control. And you can eat healthy food too for cheap. It's about, chopping around, maybe even using coupons, buying things that are on sale, whatever. But those stats really stood out to me, and that was crazy.
Yeah, and you said that So you have the numbers for the groceries, which it doesn't have exactly how much like as a percentage of their income is spending, but it was like $300, $450, $600 per month. And then you have the restaurants, which again is another. So the poorest 20% spend 16.6% of their income at restaurants. The wealthiest spend 17.8. So it seems like it's very close. Like the percentage is pretty close.
Yeah.
And so again, we've got 30% in the house. We've got 15% on the car, probably 30% on the car. That's 60. Another almost 20%, that's 80% spent on these three categories. So these are definitely, and then food definitely can get out of hand. And one thing that here that kind of blew my mind that made me sad and made me realize that I need to change my behavior. When you talk about the markup on the restaurants, and obviously like I know that it's more expensive at restaurants, but I never really thought about it too deeply. And you said that when you go to eat, what are you paying for? You're paying for the service. You're paying for it being convenient. Like they're cooking for you. Someone's bringing you your food. They're refilling your drink. The atmosphere is usually really nice. They're dressed up. You're dressed up. It's calm. There's music playing. It's dark.
Yeah.
But when you buy Uber Eats or it's food delivery, you're paying that markup. You're not getting any of it. You're sitting in your house.
Yeah.
and it's warm. It's not even good. And you feel horrible afterwards. And all you have is the convenience factor. So I'm saying this right now to all the best of your listeners. I'm doing Uber Eats once a week moving forward, maximum, and not as much as I've been doing it now at staying at home. And I'm sure a lot of other people might be relating with me. They've been getting Uber Eats, DoorDash, because again, it's super convenient. But yeah, it's really expensive. And
yeah, it certainly is. And something to think about during COVID and lockdown too. A lot of these restaurants are curbside only, delivery, takeout, whatever. And so to my wife and I anyway, when we go out to a restaurant, it's for those reasons I point out. It's either for an incredible atmosphere, it's for networking with a big group of people. It's for that type of service where maybe at home to go cook for 15 people isn't really, realistic for us. So a restaurant makes more sense as long as you're using that, in proportion and for those purposes. There's nothing wrong with restaurants. It's just to your point, if you're going out 5 times a week just because, well, I forgot to make my lunch today or whatever, I'm going to go spend $20 on lunch. That's where it can really start to kind of get out of control. So it's in your control. Everybody listening, most of our meals that we have at home are I would say $5 or less. It's pretty crazy. And they're healthy too. We're not eating, beans and rice. So.
Yeah. All right, Travis, was there anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
Again, just kind of back to the concept of enough. I think my takeaway from the study was just realize what is enough for you. And if you really do have the long-term wealth goals, you really are trying to build wealth. I think most people listening to the show they're investors of some sort or aspiring investors. These are the things that take away your long-term goals. You let this stuff get out of control and you don't hit your goals long-term. So it's kind of that, what's more important, retirement or perhaps early retirement, time freedom, all those things, or, eating out at restaurants, driving fancy cars and buying bigger and bigger homes to impress people that really don't care about you.
Exactly.
That's my take.
And then I guess my last thing would be, being real estate investors and the fact that you are able to take advantage of leverage, 3.5% down loans for house hacks, 20% down loans for investments, 25% down loans for investment. Every dollar spent on something like this equates to like $4 or more less of real estate that you can invest in, since you're able to make that money go further. So that's another way to kind of look at it too, from a more mathematical lens. So, all right, Travis, well, I've enjoyed it. Again, thank you for this blog post. I'm looking forward to applying some of these food tactics. I'm pretty good on the housing and the transportation field, but the food I'm a mess at. So I'm going to work on that, and we'll be back next week for the Actively Passive Investing Show. Best of listeners, as always, thank you for listening. Have a best ever day, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.
All right. Thanks, Theo. See you guys.